Apache woman in a winter creek, the drifter who saved her life, a Wild West true grit tale, the wind cut through the canyon like a sharp knife, carrying snow in swirling flurries that blurred the world. The sun hung low in the sky, pale and weak, struggling to shine through the thick veil of gray clouds. The winter had come early and harsh that year, and the small creek that wound through the canyon had frozen over with a thin, fragile layer of ice. The sound of the wind was constant, whispering through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees and carrying the distant call of a lone hawk searching for food. The canyon was quiet except for these small sounds, yet it was alive with danger.
Every step could be a challenge. Every moment demanded attention.
Aita moved carefully along the edge of the creek, her moccasins sinking slightly into the snow with each step. She was small and slight, but strong from years of surviving in the unforgiving land. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple braid, but stray strands whipped across her face in the wind. Her eyes, deep and sharp, scanned the snow-covered banks for anything useful. Dry branches for fire, berries or roots to eat, or tracks of animals she might follow for food. And she was alone, as she had been for many months since the raid that had taken her family away. That memory was always close, a shadow she could not shake, yet she forced herself to focus on survival. Her breath came in short, visible puffs, and her fingers were stiff with cold. She wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders, trying to keep warm as she moved carefully across the snow-covered rocks. The ice along the creek looked solid, but she knew better than to trust it completely. One wrong step could send her plunging into the freezing water below. She tested each stone with the tip of her moccasin, moving slowly, deliberately. She had to cross to the other side of the creek, where she had seen a small cluster of dry branches that would make good kindling. Suddenly, a crack split the silence like a gunshot. Her heart leapt into her throat. She froze for a moment, listening. The ice beneath her foot had groaned, thin and fragile. Then, without warning, the stone she had been testing gave way. The ice beneath her shifted and broke. Cold, icy water surged around her leg, and she lost her balance. For a second, time seemed to slow. She felt herself slipping, her arms flailing as she tried to grab onto a nearby branch. But the current of the creek, though small, was powerful, and the water swallowed her foot. The cold hit her like 1,000 tiny knives. It was more than freezing. It was burning, numbing, shocking every muscle in her body. She gasped and kicked, trying to pull herself out, but the ice and water worked against her. Her shawl, heavy with wet snow, dragged her down. Her heart pounded, panic rising as she realized she could not free herself. She screamed, her voice cracking in the cold air, but the canyon swallowed her sound. The wind carried it away, and for a terrifying moment, she thought no one would hear. Then, through the blur of snow and ice, she saw movement. A figure emerging from the tree line. At first she thought it might be a trick of her eyes, a shadow created by the swirling snow, but the figure grew closer, moving with confidence and purpose. It was a man, tall and rugged, his coat thick and worn from travel. He carried a bundle in one arm and a rifle slung across his back. But he did not hesitate. He plunged into the icy water without a second thought, boots breaking through the thin ice as he moved toward her. Aita's eyes widened in shock and fear.
She did not know him. I agree from K, a P.
She did not trust easily. And yet, in that moment, with her strength failing, she had no choice but to hope. The man reached her side, kneeling in the freezing water, and grabbed her arm with a grip that was firm but careful. His eyes met hers, dark and steady, showing no fear, only determination. He pulled with all his strength, steadying her as she clawed at the icy edge of the creek. Step by step, they moved toward the bank, and finally, with a last heave, he dragged her onto solid ground. Aita lay on the snow, gasping, her body shaking violently from the cold. The water had soaked her clothes completely, and she could feel the dangerous numbness creeping up her legs and arms. The man worked quickly, pulling a spare blanket from his bundle and wrapping it around her. He built a small fire with the branches she had been seeking, using his skill to coax a flame to life in the wet conditions. Sparks flew, and the warmth began to fight back the freezing grip of the creek water. At first, Aida could barely speak. She shivered and coughed, trying to regain control of her body. She glanced at the man, unsure whether to feel fear, gratitude, or suspicion. His presence was strange, yet comforting. She noticed the calm way he moved, the careful way he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, the way he fanned the flames to keep the fire alive. There was no hurry, no recklessness, only steady competence and focus. The drifter, who she would later know as Caleb, did not speak much. His eyes scanned the canyon constantly, alert to every sound, every movement. He poured some water from a small container into a tin cup and held it toward her. Hesitantly, she drank, the warmth of the liquid reaching her chest and offering a small relief from the icy cold. Then he offered a piece of bread, his movements slow and careful so as not to startle her. She accepted it, nibbling slowly, grateful for the kindness and for the quiet determination that radiated from him. Though words were few, an unspoken connection began to form. She realized that she had been utterly alone for months, and yet here was someone risking his life to save hers. Her heart, still racing from fear, began to slow slightly as she felt a fragile trust growing. She looked into his eyes and saw no greed, no cruelty, only a desire to help, to survive, and perhaps, in his own way, to connect. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the trees and carrying snow across the frozen creek. Aita shivered again, and Caleb adjusted the blanket around her more tightly. He knelt beside her, keeping the fire between them, eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Every few minutes he would glance up toward the tree line, alert for any sign of danger. Wild animals, hunters, or other travelers who might stumble upon them. The canyon was beautiful but merciless, and both knew that survival required constant vigilance. Hours seemed to pass as Aita slowly regained strength. She could feel the cold retreating, replaced by warmth from the fire, and the blanket around her shoulders. Her teeth still chattered occasionally, but she was no longer in immediate danger of hypothermia. She could now observe Caleb more closely, noticing the rough lines of his face, the scars on his hands, and the quiet steadiness in his movements. He was a drifter, yes, a man with no permanent home, but he carried himself with a kind of skill and confidence that suggested he had faced dangers before. By late afternoon, the wind began to die down slightly, and the snow eased to a gentle fall. The creek, now silent and still, reflected the muted light of the winter sun. Aita could feel her energy returning, and she knew that she would have to continue her journey soon. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. She was alive, and she was not entirely alone.
Caleb, noticing her improved condition, gathered some more branches for the fire and offered her another piece of bread.
She ate slowly, savoring the warmth and the sustenance. Though she did not fully understand his language, she could sense his intention. To help, to protect, and perhaps to see her safely through the immediate dangers of the canyon. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the snow-covered canyon. Aita could hear the distant call of coyotes, and she knew that the night would bring its own challenges. Yet, with Caleb by her side, she felt a measure of safety she had not known in months. The frozen creek, which had almost claimed her life that morning, now lay quiet and peaceful under the fading light. And somewhere in the distance beyond the tree line in the hills, Aita sensed that this was only the beginning. The winter was far from over, and the canyon held dangers yet unseen. But for now she was alive, warmed by fire and blanket, and watched over by a stranger who had become her unlikely protector. The wind whispered through the canyon as if carrying a message, and Aita, shivering yet safe, listened. But she did not know what the next hours or days would bring. She did not know if she could ever repay the man who had saved her life, but one thing was certain. She had survived the frozen creek, and she would fight to survive the winter, no matter what came next. The night fell fast in the canyon, bringing a deep, cold darkness that swallowed the snowy landscape. The fire that Caleb had built crackled and popped, sending warm light dancing across the walls of the small clearing. Sparks floated up into the night sky like tiny stars, then vanished into the blackness. The wind had eased slightly, but the cold was still sharp, cutting through Aita's damp shawl. She huddled closer to the fire, trying to absorb its warmth while watching Caleb. He moved with careful precision, gathering more dry branches and tending to the flames. Even in the quiet of the night, there was a sense of urgency about him. He was alert, listening, scanning, always prepared for any danger that might approach. Aita's body was still stiff from the morning's ordeal, her muscles sore and trembling. The cold water had left her weak, and the shock had drained her energy. Yet with the fire's heat and the blanket wrapped tightly around her, she began to feel a small spark of strength returning. She shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position, and noticed how Caleb moved around her. He did not speak much, but each action he took was deliberate, careful, and protective. He checked the fire, then scanned the tree line, then returned to add more small branches. Everything he did seemed aimed at keeping them both safe, and Aita felt a quiet appreciation growing within her. Bust. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words felt strange in her mouth. She was not used to speaking freely to strangers, especially men. Yet she could not ignore the feeling of gratitude that ran deep in her chest. Her eyes met Caleb's briefly, and she saw something there, something honest and strong, without judgment or expectation. That small connection was enough to give her hope, a hope she had not felt in months. The fire crackled louder, and a small ember floated into the air before landing on a dry patch of snow, where it vanished instantly. Caleb noticed and adjusted his position, careful not to let the flames get out of control. He gestured to Aita to stay close, pointing to the blanket he had spread over her shoulders. She nodded slightly, understanding without words. The quiet of the canyon surrounded them, broken only by the occasional crack of ice along the creek and the distant call of an owl. It was a peaceful yet tense silence, as though the canyon itself was watching and waiting. Hours passed slowly, and Aita felt herself growing stronger. The warmth of the fire and the safety of the blanket helped her body recover, though the memory of the icy water lingered. She could still feel the numbness in her fingers and toes, a sharp reminder of how close she had come to danger. Caleb seemed to sense her thoughts as he handed her a small cup of warm water. She drank carefully, savoring the heat that flowed down her throat and spread through her chest. Then he offered her a piece of bread. She took it slowly, chewing carefully, feeling the energy return with each bite. Though their communication was limited, a bond began to form. Aita realized that Caleb was not just a man passing through. We had purpose and skill, and he had risked his own safety to save her life. She felt a small, fragile trust taking root, one that had been absent for far too long. She watched him as he moved around the clearing, noting the way he carried himself, alert, confident, and calm. Every motion was purposeful, every glance careful. Draspy. He seemed to know the land, the weather, and the dangers that could come with both. Eventually, Caleb knelt near the fire and gestured toward the cabin he had spotted earlier in the day, hidden among the trees a short distance away, round and desperate. He pointed and then made a movement suggesting they should go there. Aita understood immediately. She had felt the cold night pressing in, and the thought of a small, sheltered space with a roof and walls was comforting beyond measure. She nodded, her body still weak, but her spirit ready to move forward. They rose carefully, Caleb supporting her slightly as they walked toward the cabin. The snow crunched under their feet, the sound echoing faintly in the canyon. The wind had died down, but it was still cold enough that every step sent shivers through Aita's body. Caleb moved ahead slightly, scanning the path for danger, then turning to guide her. She felt a mixture of fear and excitement, fear of what might be waiting, and excitement at the thought of warmth and safety. The cabin was small and simple, likely abandoned by a prospector long ago. The door creaked as Caleb pushed it open, revealing a space with a low ceiling, a small stove, and a few shelves. Though it was dusty and worn, it was dry and sheltered from the biting wind outside. Caleb motioned for Aita to enter first, and she stepped inside, grateful for the shelter. He followed, closing the door carefully behind them. The inside of the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and smoke, and Aita immediately felt a sense of relief. It was warmer than outside, and the small stove could be used to build a fire. Caleb moved quickly to gather some dry wood from a nearby pile and started the stove. Sparks flew, and soon a small, steady flame glowed, casting a warm light across the room. He gestured for Aita to sit near the fire. She obeyed, still shivering, but feeling safer than she had all day. As the fire crackled, Aita began to recover her strength. She rubbed her arms to get the circulation going and watched Caleb quietly. He seemed relaxed now, though his eyes still flicked toward the windows and the door, alert for any movement outside. She noticed the care he took with even the smallest actions, adjusting the firewood, moving slowly so as not to make noise, keeping the blankets close. It was clear he had experience surviving in the wild, and Aita felt a growing respect for him. After a few moments of silence, Aita found herself wanting to communicate. She pointed to her chest, then to herself, then made a small motion with her hands, as if gathering something. Caleb nodded slightly, understanding her gesture. But then she pointed to him and made a questioning gesture, as if asking who he was. He looked at her and, with a small smile, nodded toward himself and said his name slowly. Caleb. She repeated it carefully, trying to remember the sound. It was a simple exchange, but it was the beginning of something more. Words were not needed to understand each other's intentions. There was trust forming, quiet and strong, in the small cabin by the creek. Bright. Caleb handed her more water and she drank, feeling the warmth spreading through her body. Then he gestured toward a small bundle he carried, offering her a dry piece of cloth to wrap around herself. She accepted it gratefully, feeling safer than she had in a long time. Outside, the canyon was dark and cold. The wind had died down, but the snow still fell gently, coating the trees and rocks in a fresh layer of white. Aita could hear the distant call of wolves and the faint cracking of ice along the creek. It reminded her that danger was never far away. She shivered, but this time from awareness rather than the cold. She knew they could not stay in the cabin forever, but for the moment it was a sanctuary. Hours passed, and the fire burned low. Breaths. Caleb seemed content to sit nearby, keeping watch, occasionally adding a small branch to keep the flame alive. Aita felt her body relaxing, the tension from earlier slowly leaving her muscles. She could now think more clearly, and her mind wandered to the events that had brought her here. She remembered the raid, the loss, the cold creek, and finally, the stranger who had saved her. Her heart ached with memory, but there was also a quiet gratitude. She was alive, and she had been given a chance to survive another day. Breaths. As the night deepened, the fire cast long shadows across the cabin walls. Aita huddled close to the warmth, and Caleb continued to watch the dark outside, alert for any signs of movement. Though they did not speak, a bond had formed, a bond born of shared experience, danger, and mutual respect. Each understood the importance of the other in this small, frozen corner of the world. Finally, as the fire dwindled, Caleb gestured for Aita to lie down on a makeshift bed of blankets he had arranged on the floor. She obeyed, feeling the exhaustion of the day washing over her. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind replayed the creek, the icy water, and the moment she thought she might not survive. Yet, beside her, Caleb remained vigilant, his presence a steady reassurance that she could face another day. The wind whispered outside the cabin, carrying snow across the frozen creek. Aita listened for a moment, feeling the quiet and the cold, but also the warmth and safety inside. She realized that this night, and the stranger who had saved her, marked a turning point. Breaths. She had survived the frozen creek, and she had found someone willing to protect her in the wilderness. As she drifted into a light sleep, her thoughts lingered on Caleb and the bond they had begun to form. The winter was far from over, and the canyon held dangers yet to come. But for now, she was alive, and she had someone watching over her, a man who had risked his life to save hers. And in that small cabin by the fire and the frozen creek, Aita allowed herself a rare moment of hope. Morning came slowly in the canyon. The weak winter sun barely peeked over the snowy ridges, casting a pale light across the frozen landscape. The cabin was quiet except for the soft crackling of the small stove and the occasional shift of snow outside against the wooden walls. Aita stirred under the blankets, feeling the warmth of the fire against her back and the blanket Caleb had wrapped around her. Her muscles were sore, but she could move more freely than she had the night before. The creek's icy water was far from her mind now, replaced by a cautious sense of hope and a small, steady curiosity about the man who had saved her. Caleb had been awake for some time, sitting by the fire and listening carefully to the sounds outside. His eyes scanned the cabin walls and the windows, alert for any sign of danger. He moved quietly, adding small pieces of wood to the stove and making sure the fire was steady. Though he spoke little, his movements told Aita more than words ever could. He was experienced, cautious, and attentive, a man used to surviving in a harsh and unpredictable world.
Aita carefully rose from her makeshift bed. Her body protested the movement, sore from the previous day's ordeal, but she forced herself to stand.
She shivered slightly as the cold air touched her wet hair and damp clothes. Caleb noticed immediately and motioned toward the bundle of dry clothes he had kept aside. She understood his gesture and changed quickly, grateful for the dry garments. The warmth of the new clothes, combined with the fire, brought a comforting sense of security. Though she did not fully understand him, Aita wanted to communicate. She gestured toward herself, pointing to her chest and then to her arms, showing how cold she had been. Caleb nodded, then pointed to the fire and mimed the warmth it gave. She smiled faintly, appreciating his efforts to understand and his patience with her. For a moment, words were not needed. They shared a quiet understanding that passed without sound, a bond of trust growing slowly, carefully, between two survivors in a harsh world. After breakfast, a simple meal of bread and warm water, Caleb gestured for Aita to follow him. He had decided they could not stay in the cabin indefinitely. The canyon was beautiful but full of unseen dangers. Frozen creeks, steep cliffs, and perhaps even men or animals traveling through the snow. They needed to move carefully and find a safer route, perhaps closer to her tribe's land. Aita nodded, understanding the urgency, and gathered her few belongings. As they stepped outside, the cold air bit at her face, but she felt stronger than the day before. The sun's pale rays reflected off the snow, creating a dazzling, almost blinding effect. Caleb moved ahead, scanning the path and testing the snow-covered rocks. Aita followed closely, learning to trust his judgment, an instinct. Every few steps he would glance back to ensure she was keeping up, his eyes calm but alert. She noticed that he carried little with him, only the essentials. Yet he seemed prepared for any situation. They walked along the creek, moving slowly and carefully. The snow was deep in places, making each step an effort. Aita's breath came in small clouds and her muscles ached, but she did not complain. Caleb seemed to sense her condition, slowing his pace and encouraging her silently with small gestures. At one point he pointed to a set of tracks in the snow, animal tracks that might lead them to food or danger. Aita nodded, impressed by his knowledge and observation. But she realized that he was not just a drifter. He was a man shaped by experience, able to survive where others would falter. As they traveled, Aita began to share small pieces of her story. He used gestures and simple words, pointing to her chest and then outward to indicate her lost family, the raid, and her long months alone. Caleb listened quietly, nodding occasionally, never interrupting or judging. He offered no advice or stories of his own, but his steady presence and attentive gaze spoke volumes. For the first time in many months, Aita felt a fragile sense of relief, not just for her physical survival, but for the emotional burden she had carried alone for so long. By midday, they reached a narrow part of the canyon, where the creek widened and the ice was thinner. Caleb paused, examining the water carefully. Breath. He tested the ice with a stick, ensuring it would hold if they needed to cross. Aita watched, learning from his careful methods, and felt a small spark of confidence. Perhaps, with his guidance, she could navigate the dangers of the winter wilderness, but the canyon held more than just cold and ice. As they moved forward, Aita noticed shadows moving in the distance, faint but unmistakable. First, Caleb paused, crouching slightly, and signaled for her to stay low. He scanned the ridge carefully, then pointed toward a small grove of trees where they could take cover. Aita obeyed, feeling her heart race with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Though she had survived the creek, she knew the wilderness was unpredictable, and not all dangers came from the cold or the ice. They moved slowly, keeping low and silent. The shadows grew closer, revealing the shapes of men moving through the snow. They appeared to be hunters, or perhaps bandits, their boots heavy on the frozen ground. Caleb gestured for Aita to stay behind a tree as he observed. Brave. She crouched, trying to steady her breathing, her eyes wide as she watched him assess the situation. His calm, methodical approach gave her a sense of reassurance. She realized that his presence was more than physical protection. It was guidance, teaching her how to read the land and its hidden threats. After a tense few minutes, Caleb signaled that it was safe to move. Breaths. They slipped quietly between trees and rocks, keeping to the shadows and using the snow and terrain as cover. Aita marveled at his skill, realizing that survival was as much about knowledge and patience as it was about strength. She felt a growing respect for him, a sense that he had lived through many dangers and had learned to navigate them with care and intelligence. As they moved, Aita began to notice small signs of life in the canyon. Animal tracks, signs of food, and places where the snow had melted slightly, revealing dry ground. Caleb paused occasionally, pointing to these signs and miming their meanings. She understood that he was teaching her, sharing his knowledge of the land and the way it could provide safety, sustenance, and escape from danger. She felt a spark of excitement. Perhaps she could learn from him and survive on her own one day. By late afternoon, they reached a small clearing with a partially frozen stream. Barash. Caleb knelt to examine the water and gestures for Aita to drink. She bent carefully, cupping her hands and taking in the cold but refreshing water. The taste was clean and invigorating, reminding her of the small joys of survival. She felt a renewed sense of energy, grateful for both the water and the steady guidance of Caleb. They set up a temporary resting spot, using fallen branches and rocks to create a small shelter from the wind. Caleb arranged the fire carefully, ensuring it would burn steadily through the cold night. Aita wrapped herself in the dry blanket, feeling a sense of security she had not known in months. The bond between them had deepened, no longer just survivor and rescuer, but two people relying on each other in a dangerous, unpredictable world. As night approached, shadows lengthened across the snow, and the temperature began to drop sharply. Aita shivered, but the fire and Caleb's presence kept her warm enough. Bray. She watched him move around the small clearing, adjusting logs and checking the surrounding area. Though they had not spoken much, she felt a silent understanding growing between them. Words were not always necessary when trust and respect could be communicated through action. The wind howled softly through the canyon, carrying snowflakes and the distant cries of animals. Aida huddled near the fire, thinking of the journey ahead. She knew that danger was still present, that the canyon held both natural threats and the possibility of human ones. Yet, with Caleb beside her, she felt a courage she had not felt in a long time. She realized that survival was not just about strength or skill. It was about trust, patience, and learning to read the world around her. As they settled in for the night, Aita reflected on the day's journey. They had moved carefully, avoided danger, and grown closer in their understanding of each other. Brett. She knew the path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time she felt a sense of hope. Caleb's presence, his skill, and his quiet strength had given her more than just safety. They had given her a renewed belief in her own ability to survive. And somewhere in the shadows of the canyon, beyond the firelight, the world waited. The snow-covered rocks, the frozen creek, and the dark trees held both promise and peril. Aita knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and perhaps new dangers. But for tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace, warmed by fire and blanket, guided by the man who had become her protector and companion in the wild. The morning sun rose slowly over the snow-covered canyon, casting a soft glow across the frozen landscape. The winter air was crisp, carrying the smell of pine and the faint warmth of the sun struggling to break through the cold. Aida stirred beneath the blanket Caleb had wrapped around her the night before, feeling the comforting warmth still lingering from the small fire. Her muscles were sore, but stronger than yesterday. Brass. She could move more freely, and her spirit, too, felt steadier. She knew the journey was far from over, but she also knew she was not alone. Pretense. Caleb had been awake for some time, sitting near the fire, his eyes scanning the surrounding canyon. Though he had slept only a little, his movements were calm and deliberate. Every glance toward the tree line, every careful adjustment of the firewood showed his experience and skill. Aita watched him quietly, noticing the way his eyes moved, the way his hands handled even the smallest task with care. She felt a deep sense of respect and gratitude for this man who had appeared out of nowhere and saved her life. They ate a small breakfast, mostly dry bread and water, warming themselves beside the fire. Caleb gestured for Aita to follow him outside. The snow sparkled in the morning light, and the canyon seemed peaceful, almost inviting. Yet, Aita knew better. Winter in this land was beautiful but unforgiving. Hidden beneath the snow could be weak ice, sudden drops, or the tracks of animals or humans who might not mean them well. Rest. She followed Caleb closely, trusting his instincts and knowledge of the land. As they moved along the creek, they noticed fresh tracks in the snow. Caleb crouched down to examine them carefully. He traced the lines with a stick, pointing occasionally to guide Aita. The tracks were for men, likely travelers or hunters. The awareness of other humans nearby brought tension, but Caleb moved with calm precision. He gestured for Aita to stay low, keeping close to the trees for cover. She crouched, feeling the adrenaline mix with exhaustion, her heart pounding in rhythm with each careful step. They moved silently, keeping to the shadows and using the snow and terrain to hide their presence. Caleb led Aita to a small cluster of rocks and trees that offered partial cover. From here, they could observe the men without being seen. Aita's eyes widened as she watched, realizing the potential danger they could face. Best. Caleb placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a silent reassurance that he would guide her through. She felt a surge of trust and courage, knowing she was not alone. The men in the distance moved slowly, scanning the landscape as though searching for something. Caleb's expression remained calm, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He had taught Aita the importance of patience and observation, and she followed his lead, learning to notice subtle movements in the snow and the wind. Every rustle, every shadow was a signal. The canyon was alive, and survival meant understanding it fully. After a tense few hours, the men moved away, following a path that led them out of sight. Caleb waited for a while, ensuring they were safe before signaling to Aita that they could continue. She followed him, feeling a mix of relief and cautious anticipation. Their journey continued along the creek, with Caleb leading and Aita learning to read the land herself. Each step, each movement, strengthened her confidence and her trust in him. By midday, they reached a partially frozen waterfall. The ice glistened in the sunlight, reflecting 1,000 tiny rainbows across the snow. Caleb knelt to examine the path, testing the ice with a stick before carefully stepping forward. Aita followed, stepping carefully where he led, feeling her confidence grow with every safe step. She began to understand the rhythm of the land, the subtle signs that indicated safety or danger. Caleb's guidance had transformed fear into careful knowledge, and she felt empowered. As they moved beyond the waterfall, the canyon opened slightly, revealing a wider valley covered in snow. The landscape was breathtaking, with towering cliffs on either side and distant peaks shimmering in the sunlight. But yet Aita knew beauty could be deceptive. The snow might hide unstable ground, and the wide valley offered little cover if danger appeared. Caleb gestured for them to keep moving, and they pressed forward, alert to every sound and movement around them. Eventually, they reached a small grove of trees that marked the edge of the canyon. Caleb paused, scanning the area carefully. He pointed ahead, then made a motion suggesting Aita should follow him. They moved cautiously, stepping over fallen branches and carefully around patches of thin ice. Aita felt a growing sense of anticipation. Rocks, trees, and distant hills that suggested her tribe's territory might be near. Her heart lifted with hope, but she also remained cautious, remembering the dangers they had faced. As afternoon approached, they encountered a frozen creek wider than any they had crossed before. Caleb examined it carefully, testing the ice and the current. He gestured for Aita to stay back as he found a narrow path of rocks and ice that could support both of them. Step by step, he moved across first, testing each rock and patch of ice. Aita followed carefully, trusting his judgment, her heart racing with each step. At last they reached the other side safely, and she let out a quiet sigh of relief. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley. Caleb suggested they rest briefly before continuing. They found a sheltered spot near a cluster of pine trees and a small mound of rocks. Caleb built a small fire, careful to protect it from the wind. Aita huddled close to the warmth, grateful for his guidance and the growing bond between them. She realized that without him, she would not have survived the creek, the frozen valleys, or the hidden dangers of the canyon. While resting, Aita gestured toward the distance, pointing to the hills that stretched beyond the valley. She mimed a motion indicating her tribe, showing that she hoped they were close. Caleb nodded, understanding her meaning. Though their words were limited, their understanding had grown far beyond language. He handed her a piece of bread and a cup of water, gestures of support and care that spoke more than words could. Aita felt gratitude and respect welling up inside her, mingled with hope for the journey's end. As night began to fall, the canyon darkened, and the temperature dropped sharply. They packed the small fire carefully, ensuring it left no trace, and continued toward the distant hills. The snow muffled their steps and the wind carried the cold, but Aita felt steady and alert. Caleb moved ahead, guiding her carefully through the terrain. The sense of danger had not vanished entirely. There were still tracks in the snow, and the wilderness itself could be unforgiving. But Aita felt capable, strengthened by the lessons she had learned. Finally, as dusk turned to dark, the distant lights of a small settlement appeared, smoke rising from chimneys, the faint glow of fires and lanterns. Aita's heart leapt. She recognized the signs of her tribe's territory. She whispered a quiet thanks, though Caleb could not hear, and she felt a surge of relief. After months of hardship, of being alone in the frozen wilderness, she would soon be safe among her people. Caleb guided her carefully through the last stretch, using every skill he had to ensure their safety. They moved quietly, aware that strangers in the territory might cause concern. At last, they reached the edge of the settlement. Aita paused, looking back at Caleb, her eyes reflecting gratitude, respect, and a bond forged in hardship. She wanted to say more, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she offered a small, silent gesture of thanks, a nod, a look, a shared understanding of all they had endured together. Caleb smiled faintly, his own eyes reflecting a mix of pride and respect. He had risked much to guide her safely, but the reward was clear. She had survived, stronger and wiser, and he had played a part in that survival. Though he would continue his wandering life, the memory of saving Aita and guiding her through the winter canyon would remain with him always. As Aita stepped into the settlement, she was greeted by familiar voices, calls of concern, and the warmth of people who had feared she might never return. She shared the story of the frozen creek, the treacherous canyon, and the stranger who had saved her life. Her people listened, amazed by her courage and the unexpected bond that had formed between her and Caleb. She felt a deep sense of belonging, a contrast to the loneliness of the canyon, and a gratitude that ran deep. Caleb watched from a short distance, content to see her reunited and safe. He knew this was the end of his role in her journey, yet he felt a quiet satisfaction. The canyon had tested them both. The winter had challenged them, but they had survived. Aita had learned to trust, to navigate danger, and to rely on both her own strength and the guidance of another. And Caleb, in turn, had found purpose in protecting someone in need, leaving a lasting mark on her life. As night fell over the settlement, the snow reflecting the soft glow of fires, Aita looked back once toward the canyon. She remembered the frozen creek, the harsh wind, the perilous paths, and the moments when fear had threatened to overwhelm her. But she also remembered Caleb, his calm presence, his careful guidance, and his courage. The memory of him would stay with her, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, survival was possible. With courage, skill, and the help of those willing to risk everything for another. And so, in the quiet winter night, with the creek frozen behind them and the warmth of her people around her, Aita allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. She had faced danger, learned resilience, and discovered the strength of trust. The canyon, the creek, and the wilderness had tested her, but she had emerged stronger. But somewhere, beyond the trees and the snow-covered hills, Caleb would continue his journey, carrying the memory of a life saved and a bond forged in the wild.